Welcome to another episode. We are here with Seton Bailey. He is not traditionally known as an environmentalist, but has a deep passion and care for our planet and climate change. And we have him here to share his knowledge on the topics and help us simplify some of the terms for laymen. Seton.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what we're involved in is communication. And it's finding visuals or really, really clear and uncomplicated ways of explaining things. And I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to be able to do that in the course of this interview, but I'll certainly give it a good try. But one of the things that we've always found incredibly frustrating is that one feels quite helpless in the face of local and global environmental disasters, like floods and typhoons and cyclones and all those kind of things, which we often credit to climate change. And everybody says, well, what can we do about it? But I think that what really makes the planetary boundaries so valuable as a frame of reference is that sometimes, although it sounds remote and academic, it helps us understand the limits of the boundaries within which we as humans can safely operate. That is to mitigate environmental damage and to really preserve and conserve and protect the natural environments and the world as we know it. So rather than seeing them as remote kind of planetary constellations like the stars out there, let's try and look at them as things that we can all relate to and that we can apply to in our own lives in terms of the choices and decisions that we make.
So you mentioned how sometimes we do feel helpless with these changes in the climate and the weather. Can you think of any events in South Africa that you feel that would be relevant to most people that affected the climate?
Yeah, I mean, climate change, as we know it, is really reflecting significant changes in global temperatures and weather patterns. And the weird thing about it is that it's mainly due to human activities, just simply like burning fossil fuels and deforestation. So I think we have to think about that. Climate change, again, is not a remote thing. It's something that impacts all of us, and we all burn fossil fuels. In the middle of winter, we have fires, and that wood on a fire is burning fossil fuels. And huge industries that operate with a massive industrialization even in a third world country, third world country like South Africa. Huge industrialization and burning of fossil fuels has a significant impact on the climate. So we've had terrible floods in Natal, in KZN. We've had storms, we've had floods, and I mean we've had so many different things that it's hard to single any particular one out. But one can't help but feel that these are a result of our actions, of our activities.
What do you think we could do differently?
I think that every single act, every single action in which we engage in the world has consequences. So I'm not going to speak specifically to climate change, but if I just think about microplastics in the water, I mean, we've got to be very, very careful about our use of plastic. It's so easy just to get a plastic packet at the shops and get another one the next time you go there. But take your own bags, take your own recyclable bags, we can't, it's hard to comprehend, but they're finding microplastics in fish that we're eating today. And that's got to be affecting our health. I mean, can you imagine that when you sit down for a delicious fish dish, you're actually eating plastic. And that's a consequence of us putting plastic in the ocean. So really, yeah, every decision, every action that we make, it involves a choice or a decision, and it's a decision that we need to make considering the planetary boundaries, how to stay within them.
So what are the primary drivers for biodiversity loss in South Africa?
Well, I mean, the maintaining of biosphere integrity and biodiversity loss, certainly, it involves the health of our ecosystems and obviously the diversity of our species. And that's the species loss obviously is genetic diversity, and the disruption of the ecosystems is functional diversity. But we just have to look at issues like rhino poaching. A black rhino are an endangered species, and that's a huge issue again in terms of that biodiversity and that genetic diversity. Pangolins, which are hugely sought after creatures globally, those are very, very rare, remarkable creatures, And what we have to start trying to do is to enlighten and educate our communities wherein these animals are as to how valuable these are as a resource, And one of the elements that arises there, obviously, is in situations where people are trying to preserve the black rhino. They have to provide the communities around where the black rhinos are an incentive to not poach the rhino, So they have to be involved in those parks. They have to be involved from an employment perspective, from an equity perspective, from a whole range, in terms of sustainable tourism, as we all know. So, yeah, I would say that there are many, many ways we can fight this. There's a huge issue with the poaching of lizards and of succulents in the Namaqualand. And what we have to do, again, is communicate to the local communities how priceless these resources are and how much more valuable they are for us to retain them than to sell them to the world and lose them.
Could you tell us more about that specific one? What are they doing there with the cultivation?
Well, what we're experiencing in areas like Namaqualand is that there's a massive poaching of succulents, and the potential for these succulents to provide incredible health remedies that are thousands of years old, and many of these amazing plants, has been forgotten, because in many respects we've kind of forgotten about cultural conservation, which is conserving traditions and practices that have been practiced for hundreds and, in some instances, many hundreds of years. So we've got to again start reawakening people as to the value of our natural resources, and rather than people taking a corner cafe mentality, so to speak, and just poaching and selling them to the first person that comes along. And there, I think we need to encourage people to get involved in artwork and to maybe create ways of producing these succulents in an art form and selling them, or making them out of clay and selling them to tourists. And likewise the lizards. I mean, these incredible lizards that articulate, that people make, that the locals make. There's a fantastic opportunity to earn money other than to give away our most precious resources.
It actually could be an economic driver as well, not just for the environment. Do you know anything about how any invasive species, how do invasive species affect the biodiversity in South Africa?
I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I can't really give you a breakdown on how that happens. But it would seem pretty obviously that the resources that are available start being absorbed. So, for argument's sake, if you just think about pine trees, and they draw huge amounts of water, which could be far better deployed with local and indigenous plants like this beautiful speckboom, which doesn't need very much water and makes it another unique product in our world. But no, I don't have a very deep insight into that at all.
Okay, cool. So how has deforestation for agriculture affected biodiversity in South Africa?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of a no-brainer if you consider the huge development of agriculture, across vast areas, and over and above that, agriculture, but urban development. That's another massive issue. And all of these involve not only specifically deforestation, but very often the removal of indigenous vegetation. And I think it's a really huge issue that when you're converting forests and natural vegetation into farmland or urban areas, you're going to be depleting us of one of our most priceless resources. So again, you have to ask those big developers, the people who are going into this for the money, if they're not taking a rather short-term approach to this whole thing, again, a kind of a corner cafe mentality, when they could be looking at it in the longer term and being much more careful.
So what are the environmental impacts on rapid urbanization on South Africa?
Well, I think rapid urbanization and even incremental urbanization is having a huge impact on our biodiversity. One classic example is that of the baboon population in the Cape Peninsula here in the Western Cape. They're in a very specific area where they're prevented from going anywhere else by a massive city. So there's increasing conflict between the baboon population and and the human population, and a very, very low kind of tolerance threshold level. So the baboons are unfortunately the victims, because humans have things like guns and paint guns, and they actually do what they need to do in order to keep the baboons out. But it really is affecting a very, very amazing resource, these baboons.
But still on that, the urbanization one, how do you feel we, again, as regular people, can impact that or affect that? Is there anything we can do?
Well, different people have different needs and different goals and different objectives. Everybody lives their own lives, and the people that live in homes where baboons regularly raid them will say, we want to get rid of them, I think what we've got to try and do is not have a reactive response to situations, but take a broader, proactive response to situations, which is looking for sustainable solutions within those environments and situations. So if, for argument's sake, baboons need to be captured and relocated to other areas, that's a possibility. There are many potential solutions for the baboon problem, but the biggest problem at the moment we're having is just that it's literally two groups coming smack together and fighting it out. And of course the humans are stronger because they've got weapons and they've got brains and the resources that go beyond the capability of baboons. So the baboons are invariably the casualties. But just in general, I think we've got to be very, very considerate and very proactive in the choices and the decisions that we make.
So everyone that watches the news and sees media would be aware of the water issues and crises we've had in Cape Town. Could you give us a breakdown of what actually caused the water crisis?
Well, I don't think it's a secret, number one, that massive quantities of water that are for rainwater, for example, just run off straight into the ocean in an area like the Western Cape. But I think that the real crisis in this country and in this region has been abuse of water as opposed to use of water. I think that there's a very poor maintenance of water fixtures, of filtration fixtures, things that control taps, simple things like that. And I think there's a huge leakage factor, both in the Western Cape and in South Africa. I think that we use far more water than we have the capability to generate. And we know that there are underground aquifers, but we certainly don't want to go into those and tap them if we can actually use the water that we have in the world. But I think it's really just we don't judiciously use or utilize our water. We waste it, and I think it's a terrible issue. That I think it's something we need to address far more strongly in local government and in education.
So do you feel government could do more in terms of the education of the usage on that, or would it be a private sector thing?
Oh, I think both. I think the private sector. But I think the government needs to implement policies which actively encourage people to save water, to conserve it. But I think it should be implemented through the private sector, education in industry and companies, that people don't abuse water. And also, I think the other issue with fresh water is the pollution of freshwater reserves. I mean, we have terrible pollution in South Africa, where runoffs from plants and from mines just go into freshwater rivers, and it's something that's affecting our country, it's affecting our lives, and it's affecting our future.
So you had mentioned the story when you were one of the times you went to Antarctica, where one of your summit partners had damage in their eyes. Could you explain to us what caused that damage?
Well, I think that ozone depletion was something people say happened around 2000. But in actual fact, when we first went to Antarctica in 1987, and I've been there 4 times, we were smack in the hole in the ozone layer. And the person whom we were supporting and who we were preparing to go and walk to the South Pole, when he got there, he had actually developed severe eye damage as a consequence of, we assumed, the hole in the ozone layer. So, stratospheric ozone depletion is a very, very frightening concept. And I think, obviously, as we know, industrial processes and consumer products result in the emission of the halogen, of halogen source gases. And I mean, there's an issue relating to methyl bromide, which we were hoping had been cleared up thanks to the what is the protocol? Now I've forgotten, the Montreal Protocol, if I'm not mistaken, in 2015. But we still don't know what's going into soils, in terms of soil fumigation and the ozone depletion substances that are going into soils for crops like beans and nuts. They're supposed to have been targeted and phased out around 2015. But with the huge industrialization of agriculture and production, it's not like we can go and monitor each and every little product that we're eating to discover how much ozone was depleted in its production, because industrialization is a massive factor in the problem that we're facing.
So how do you feel the industrialization is impacting on planetary boundaries?
I think one of the important things about so-called sustainable industrialization, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms, is really about better regulation. And I think it's about very, very considered, judicious technological innovations. Whatever you innovate with, make sure that it doesn't impact negatively on the environment. And the other thing that I think is underrated, largely, to a large degree, is promoting circular economic principles. In other words, if you use something, if you consume something, then recycle it and reuse it. And I'll give you a really good example. We're in the film industry, and we take all the polyurethane and polystyrofoam that we use to build sets, and we turn it into bricks. And those bricks build schools and community centers in the peri-urban communities around the city. And to me, the circular economy is hugely underrated because it's a fantastic opportunity to help minimize waste and resource consumption. I suppose, in a way, sustainable industrialization is really aiming to balance economic development with environmental protection, but sometimes I feel we're fighting a losing battle. One of the elements relating to sustainable industrialization would be how judiciously we use water. And certainly, if you consider soft drink manufacturers, no names, no pactoral, it takes a huge amount of fresh water to produce 750 mils or a liter of carbonated sweetened soda water. It's a very, very, very costly process in terms of water utilization. Large amounts of water are used, in the process. And it's certainly going to strain our local and international water resources if we're not more careful, especially in water-stressed regions. I think we've got to be very, very considerate and very careful.
So what are some sources of persistent organic pollutants in South Africa that you could give us?
I think you're referring to the introduction of novel entities when it comes to the planetary boundary, yeah. I think we're talking about subjects like heavy metals and radioactive materials, but I think most importantly, we're talking about plastics, because the impact of plastic is just polyethylene terephthalate as a plastic is just all pervasive, and we're not even just talking about plastic bottles, but we're talking about microplastics and the presence of microplastics in the ocean. And I think I referred to this earlier, but just next time you order some fresh fish, just imagine that probably a small percentage of the fish that you're eating actually has within it microplastics, because the ocean has become one of the world's largest plastic dumping grounds. It's a frightening thought. But that's certainly going to have a very harmful effect on not only the environment, but on our health as human beings. So we'd be very silly to ignore it. And each and every one of us in our own capacity can actually recycle plastic. Instead of throwing it into the bins that go onto landfills or into the ocean, we can recycle it. It's a resource. In 1987, I was wearing a fleece that we had made out of polyethylene terephthalate, PET, that we'd recycled and put into as clothing.
So you feel like we can definitely do more as people, and corporate industries can do a little bit more as well. Can you think of other examples of things that we could do terms of, so there's a certain brand I know that they do upcycling on billboards. So once the billboards are done being used, they take the fragments of it and they create little bags and little things about it to also conserve the conserve the environment. Do you have any examples of anything like that?
Well, I think each and every person can actually do something about it. Instead of throwing away stuff which goes to landfill, one can actually put, you can fill up these large 1.5 and 2 liter bottles with bits of substances that are obviously non-biodegradable, and then seal them, and then they can use them as bricks to build houses. So there are a million and one ways one can do things like that. I think I mentioned earlier the idea of taking polyurethane and polystyrofoam and turning it into bricks, which is what we're doing. We've just got to make sure that we create circular economies wherever we go and whatever we do, and that's the single most important thing.
Would you want to talk to us about conservation?
Obviously, conservation refers to the preservation and protection of our environment, but I think people always think about nature when they think about conservation, to prevent wasteful destruction and neglect or misuse or abuse of our resources, But it can apply to quite a few different contexts. I think that natural resources are a very, very important area that we have to focus on: water, forests, wildlife, and all that sort of thing. And that's creating some kind of environmental sustainability for future generations. But protecting and restoring natural environments and ecosystems, while that's also incredibly important and critical to our future, there's also cultural conservation. And peculiarly, it links very, very closely to natural and environmental conservation. Because if you consider the amazing, amazing plants that exist here in this country, South Africa, which can provide amazing and wonderful medical and health restorative powers, and yet nobody really knows about them because the people who've used them over the hundreds and hundreds of years are dying off, and people are not necessarily involved enough in cultural conservation and cultural heritage to preserve these. Because, again, fantastic example, speckboom. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful plant. Its capacity to do so many things is just extraordinary. And likewise, if you consider its ability, so we're told, it can lower your blood pressure and it can help people with type 1 diabetes and so many other things. But we haven't explored this. We haven't even researched this enough to use these amazing, amazing resources. So I think conservation is really, really important. But I also think taking conservation as a remote or as an academic term and applying it to everything we do is really, really important too. In other words, communicating conservation to non-conservationists. And by that, it's trying to influence people in terms of the decisions and the choices they make, using fertilizer for their plants or whatever they're doing, use of fresh water or any of the 9 planetary boundaries, which we know all about, which we've talked about.